Hi friends, today we are going to learn how to do the couching stitch. The couching stitch is one of my personal favorites. I use it all the time. So grab a hoop with some fabric in it, some yarn, and a needle and thread. I've got about 18 inches of DMC embroidery floss and I'm using all 6 strands. I like to start off with a stay stitch. This is optional. You could knot your work at the back and just keep going. I like to use a stay stitch because it keeps the back really clean. So you just sew a very small stitch to start and then pin the tail down when you come up for the next stitch. This works well when you have something that will cover up that first stitch, like the yarn used here will cover up that first stitch in this example. So once you've got that stay stitch in place, we'll grab our yarn. I'm using chunky yarn here and we'll place it across the top. If I was following a specific pattern or something like that, I would have drawn it on in advance, but right now we're just going to do a straight across line. So to couch, you tack down the yarn with just short perpendicular stitches like this. I like to do my first stitch and then tug the yarn into place to make a shorter tail, and then you keep going. When I'm doing chunkier yarn like this, I tend to do about a finger width apart, and I scale the distance between stitches based on how thick the material I'm working with is. So you just keep going, tacking your yarn down with those short stitches. And one of the big things to note is that you come up and go down in 2 different places. You never want to go through the same hole. It will weaken your fabric by pushing a really big hole into it, which is not as good, and it can make it a little lumpy. So you always want to go down near your first hole, but not into the same one. Once you are done, we are going to flip the work over and weave the ends in. So that's just taking that thread and basically sewing it underneath the stitches that are already created. This is also optional. It's another one of the knotless techniques that I like to use to keep the back of my work really clean. So once the ends are woven in, you'll just trim that tail, and the thread being buried underneath the stitches will hold it in place. Now we are going to trim the yarn that is on top of the work. So to do this, we are going to trim that yarn as close to each of the starting and ending stitches as possible. This is why it's nice to leave about 1 inch at the start, because you can get a good hold on it to pull it and then get a really clean cut, nice and tight against that first stitch. For this next example, I'm going to show you the couching stitch using worsted weight yarn, which is a much thinner yarn than the first yarn that I showed you. So I started off with a stay stitch just like I did before, and I'm going to start doing those perpendicular stitches to hold it down. And I pull that tail a little closer so it's less than 1 inch when I'm working with thinner yarn. And like I said before, I stitch closer together as well when I'm working with thinner yarn, so probably about half a finger width apart on these stitches here. And the same things apply as before. Make sure you're going down near the hole where you came up from, but not going back into the same hole. And we will just stitch along like this for a little bit. Now that we're done, we're going to flip the work over and weave the ends in at the back. This is another technique that is a way to keep your thread secure without knotting your work at the back. So you just Bury the needle underneath a few of those stitches that you've already done, and then you trim the excess thread, and this pins the tail in place without having to tie a knot, which is my personal preference. And now we're going to flip it back over and trim the excess yarn just like we did with the chunky yarn, and we try to get it as close to those stitches as we can without popping it out from underneath that first stitch. And we are done. So that's the couching stitch using 2 different kinds of yarn. I hope you enjoyed this. If you found this tutorial useful, don't forget to like and subscribe.